Welcome to our Japanese-style living environment webinar series. We'll soon be in conversation with Jay Van Arsdale about Japanese-style situational joinery for building dwelling structures. Thank you for joining us. We'd like to extend a special thanks to our partners who make this programming possible: the Japan Foundation for Global Partnership, the Oakland-Fukuoka Sister City Association. My name is Peter Boyer, your moderator. I'm pleased to introduce Jay Van Arsdale. In this program, Jay Van Arsdale will look at typical situations where and why joinery is used and has been used in traditional construction in Japan. Joinery is wood-to-wood connections using no nails, glue, or metal fasteners. Jay will examine ways joinery suits structural and aesthetic needs and the tools to create these long-lasting and beautiful constructions across historical contexts and requirements. Jay Van Arsdale is a longtime California daiku, living and working in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's one of the founding members of Kezuroukai.usa, Kezuroukai.us, a nonprofit teaching organization chartered by Kezuroukai Japan. He is also the founder of Daiku Dojo, DAIKUDOJO.org, holding classes and workshops in his shop and at Laney Community College, Oakland, California, for over 20 years. Also at the Merritt Community College Landscape Horticulture Department and the Arques Boat Building School in nearby Sausalito. Jay is author of Shoji, Designing, Building, and Installing Japanese Screens, published by Kodansha International. A couple of 2-hour tutorial DVDs, one called Connections and Kana Wonders and Workings of Japanese Hand Planes. Jay has written many articles and given many demonstrations since he started in the middle 1970s, inspired by Japanese daiku Makoto Imai. He has twice appeared on Japanese television. Jay grew up in Kentucky in his family blacksmith shop, graduated from Center College 1970, Danville, Kentucky, and received a master's in fine arts in sculpture from Mills College in Oakland, California in 1972. Welcome, Jay Van Arsdale.
Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the Japanese Living Environment webinar on situational joinery with Jay Van Arsdale. We're having some technical difficulties this morning. We are indeed employing 2 separate laptops, and we've never done that before. So we're not going to have the normal slides for you to refer to in terms of how to use your toolbar at the bottom of your screen. I am going to explain it to you now verbally, and then I'll be busy typing it into the chat while Jay is delivering the webinar. So there's no rush. Turns out we have plenty of time. I had told most of you that this would be a 3-hour webinar, and there was a lot of confusion over when it started, and I hope you all got the notice, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And that leaves plenty of time for us to spill over. We will definitely wrap this up before 12 noon. Jay's got a lot of material on situational joinery, and he's going to explain what that means. And afterwards, if there's interest, there might be time for us to go visit some related websites, such as the group of Japanese traditional joinery carpenters that Jay is involved in, Kezuroukai Dojo, which is similar but different. And he'd explain all that. We'll see if he can tarry. So, meanwhile, this program and 8 other programs have all been made possible by a grant from the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. And indeed, we have at least one of their staffers attending this very webinar as we speak. Funding and production is also supplied by the Oakland, California, Fukuoka, Japan Sister City Association. And I want to also extend my thanks to the many other Japan Sister City organizations that are either attending, but certainly spreading the word. We owe additional thanks to the Sukiya Living magazine for publicizing these events as well, and to the North American Japanese Garden Association, known as NAJGA. And NAJGA is actually helping the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership in coordinating this initiative to offer information to the next generation on the really the World Heritage gift and arts, you know, in other words, the humanity that developed in this very unusual island nation. And it's a real pleasure to have a hand in offering lessons in that particular people's experiment with life to the rest of the world. So if you've got friends anywhere in the world, they're welcome to tune in. Okay. My name again is Peter Boyer. I will serve as your moderator, and Jay will be doing most talking. You'll be rid of me soon. You've probably all read all about Jay, so he doesn't need that much introduction, but I just want to say Jay's been a rock in this webinar series, in NAJGA, every 2-year biannual conferences. Biennial, I don't know. And every week for a long, long time, and going forward at the Laney Community College, where he teaches traditional Japanese wood joinery. And by the way, he's teaching this year and probably next semester too. Lord knows, let's hope it ends soon, but via Zoom. So anywhere in the country, you can enroll in Jay's class. California residents, it's a particularly economical opportunity for you. Without further ado then, Jay Van Arsdale.
Thank you, Peter.
We're going to hit the share screen to find your slideshow there, Jay.
Okay. Well, let's see.
Is it open already? The slideshow?
Yeah, I'm going to do it off Peter.
Oh, off the camera.
Okay. Thank you, Peter, for all that information. I know myself, it's been really an opportunity and a real advantage to commiserate with all these volunteers that run these incredible organizations. NAJGA, worked with them for a while, trying to incorporate some of the traditional construction into the remodeling and restoration of all the gardens that are in the United States. 5 or 6 years ago, some friends and I set up a nonprofit called Kezuroukai.usa, We got chartered from Japan, Kezuroukai. So we were the first outside of Japan group to be recognized by them. So it was a real honor for us. A lot of us here have been working at this for a long time and found a real place for it in our life. I live in Oakland in the Bay Area, and there's a pretty good craftsman scene and a lot of artists. And, now that the internet's here and we got to depend more on that, it really opened up things that probably weren't available before. But again, all these person-to-person grassroots kind of organizations, I think, really share the spirit of what this is all about. And really, it's really an incredible thing. I got interested in this by seeing a daiku work, Makoto Imai, and the whole thing really tied in a lot of interesting, curious facts for me. And I think you'll find some of this very interesting yourself, even if you're not a woodworker. So what I want to try to do in this short thing here is bring a little cognition to what you're actually seeing when you see these buildings and this kind of craftsmanship. I think it's important to realize, I know it was for me, my education was all mostly European oriented, American history. There wasn't much about Asia or the Orient. And, I think that's really a big part that's left out of the world. The Europeans did a lot of good and bad, and when you realize that they were really influenced early on by China and the Silk Road, which isn't really something that's promoted in the Western vocabulary very much. But if you realize that China was doing business along the Silk Road all the way into Greece. I mean, the Romans were wearing silk togas, right? So what came that way came back this way to Japan. Japan was at the end of the Silk Road, so it was really been a repository for things that I don't think exist anywhere else. A lot of the Chinese things that came in, they aren't in China anymore. I know cloth samples and things that came from Persia that probably aren't in Persia anymore. So the Japanese really have a high respect for old things and traditional things, and they've gone to great share these with the world, which is part of what we're trying to do here on a grassroots level. We appreciate all the support we get from people who can help us out. And I think that's how we learn. You learn these things you don't really know that you're learning them, and that to me is really an important thing. So again, I want to talk today not as a scholar about all this, but as a craftsman who's been working this way for over 40 years. I grew up in a very rural area. A lot of old school stuff, which to me, I really appreciate having that experience. So when I ran into this, I could really have a deeper understanding of it and what the intentions were from these craftsmen, because I grew up around craftsmen. So what I want to say is thinking about all the joinery and the buildings and the designs and things that are in Japan is a daunting. My own experience, I want to try to share with you some of the things that I found very curious and things that led me on to research and discover things. I didn't study in Japan. I've been to Japan a few times. I have a lot of friends in Japan that are traditional craftsmen, and I've learned a lot from them. And it's really been something that's added a lot of depth to not only the skills that I could develop, but the intention of what these people were trying to do. Being a craftsman, you're trying to do the best work you can. Excuse me. And when I saw Makoto work, it was something, it was a real treasure. Excuse me. So what I want to start off here with is part of our education, can be live and intact and with people and working with people or watching demos and instruction, but a lot of it now is through some much more incredible books that have been translated and put together. YouTube and Facebook have a lot of postings and things of people that are out there doing things and willing to share their expertise and their insights on things. And, there's a lot of layering going on here now. So again, the internet, I think, is going to open up a lot of things that we can't really read about that help you to understand. I know seeing things and seeing them done is much better than some kind of verbal explanation. But we start with what we got and work towards something that completes kind of the picture more, which will lead us on to other things. So any answers I hope I can give you here would just lead you to more questions and curiosity for yourself, because it's such a wide open topic with all the craftsmanship in Japan, everything from everything, it's really quite an incredible country in that they maintain all this traditional sites and information and skills, and at the same time they're leaders in all kinds of artificial intelligence and computer controlled things, and that's a whole nother side of the coin here. But what I was more interested in and really affected by was the depth of traditional crafts and their intentions. So I got a couple of books I want to start off with here, and see, this book is a book, I think it's still in print. It's called The Japanese House, Tradition for Contemporary Architecture by Heinrich Engel. This German guy with his outline brain has a lot of good pictures and diagrams and history about all this. To me, it's kind of the fundamental Bible of all this kind of building crafts, because it's got it touches on about every base. So what I want to start off with was this old picture, this drawing of this original daiku. Again, like I said, Japan was the inroad of the Silk Road. And again, they had a lot of conferences with other countries that came through China and through Korea, and they brought in a lot of information. So again, part of this is tracing ideas of simplicity and functionality around the world. We don't know where these ideas started from. I mean, some of the oldest mortise and tenon kind of construction, to me, they found that the Stonehenge, those big the monoliths that they have with the lintels across the top, they have pockets chopped out of them that a little stub went into on the top of that to hold those things in places. The Egyptians, they had copper saws. They were doing joinery in the furniture and the boats they built, and again, part of what to me is interesting is how people solve these problems with what they've got, what they know, and the technology they got. So to me, without understanding how the tools were developed that made technology increase production and sophistication, is really an incredible connection there that we can learn from. We can't really look back at, well, we do, but what I'm trying to say is that it's really more enlightening to understand how these old buildings were built and how they were built and with what kind of tools they were built and the ingenuity and the real skill that was developed here. So again, this picture is in this book. I don't know what that says. I don't read Japanese. This guy really looks Chinese to me with the hat that he's got, right, and all his investments. So again, what really started the sophistication, I think, in Japan was the introduction of Buddhism into Japan in the 600s, and it came in a couple of different waves. And at each time, you could see much more sophisticated construction coming along. First, the temples that were built were more or less copies of Indian buildings from India. Then later on became the Chinese style buildings, which had a much more sophisticated construction methods and were painted. And then it wasn't until probably the 13th and 14th century that the Weiyo style started with the Japanese, their own style of construction. So they've taken in these ideas and these construction modes, and they've sophisticated them and brought them into their own relevancy, because like each country has its own climate, its own terrain, its earthquakes, whatever happens, So, I mean, in Japan and China, there's a lot of earthquakes that really affect how buildings stand up. So all that has to be taken into consideration. But what I wanted to start off with this guy was looking at what he had here. All the tools that he's using here, which a lot of these other pictures in this book show this, is he had a chona, right, which is a cross adze that's used for rough shaping. He has a sumasashi, which is the square. He has a wooden mallet. He has a chisel, and he has a sumitsubo. Now, to me, because the guy's hat looks Chinese, and this sumitsubo is a really old style. Sumitsubo is a marking gauge. It has ink. I'll show you that in a minute. But it's an old style because the back end is split, and the wheel that the string winds up is open there. So again, at this point, steel was very scarce. He doesn't even have a metal hammer. He's got a wooden mallet, right? So the wooden mallet and a chisel. Chisels and sharp edges have never been a problem for the Japanese because of their sword production and the highest quality steel and laminations that their blacksmiths developed. First off, in chisels and axes. Again, I think without that sharp chisel, you won't get the perfection and the efficiency that you get from other tools. So that's one of the high marks of the Japanese culture, is their metal making ability and being able to smelt tamahagani, which is a sword sand steel that comes out of the rivers that they cook up in a special furnace called that they get the steel from. So they've always had really sharp chisels, and with that you can look at it. So again, I see this in one sense as some really elaborate sculpture that has a very definite function, and their intention is definitely clear. And the extremes that they went to in building some of these temples, I think, is really interesting. So one of the things that I heard that I found out that was really, to me, insightful was the square that they use here called sumasashi. Their measurement is called the shaku, which I'll show you later, and it's a 10 scale. Go back up here. Wrong button, sorry. This is the square called sumasashi, and it has a 10 scale on, which is called the shaku. I'm sure that comes from Chinese. What I've heard when I was in Japan last time, I was at Todaji with a friend of mine who had been there with one of the people that we'd studied with that had made a lot of the reproductions of the old tools. Was talking about when they did this, they bring all these, there was like 1 million people that worked on that at one time. I don't really understand the economics of all that, but it put a lot of stress on the government and the people to support and house all these people for these years they were working on it. So one of the genius ideas they had was they standardized the length of the measurements that everybody was using. So they gave them the pieces they need to make it at home in your shop, and then bring them and we'll put them together. We don't have to have you here for years to make these pieces and support you. You can do that on your own. So, something as simple as that, to me, is really an insight into how you make this stuff much more practical, because the scale they're working on is still unimaginable when you go visit these old temples. Again, and part of what's kept all this going is that they have to maintain these temples with the tools and the techniques they had at that time. So a lot of these guys, like when you're looking at the guy sitting there with his tools, he didn't have saws. He didn't have a plane. He had his chona, which is an old style chona. It's got a bent wooden handle right? And that was what they chopped the wood down, flattened it off with. In those days, they could get really straight grain wood, so they could probably split out pieces pretty good. This they would chop down and smooth it off some. And then their finishing tool would have been a yarigana, which again is a spear plane. I mean, you see this came right off of a spear. It's got different sweeps in it for different parts of it. So once you'd split the wood and you kind of smooth it off with the chona, then they'd come back with the yarigana and get a smoother surface. It didn't give you a flat, smooth surface specifically like a hand plane because your blade isn't set up to do that. But again, it gives you a really nice texture. I use it a lot myself for the texture because I can plane wood make it really smooth. It's really interesting to see how the development of these tools came along and how it changed what they could do. So I mean, again, with just a chisel and a hammer, it's really surprising, you know, what you can do with that in terms of sculpting out very accurate pieces. They know what all those tools were pretty much by looking at the chop marks and cut marks on all these temples when they go back to work on them or restore them. They can know about that. So, you know, it wasn't probably until 1300s or so that they developed the Japanese hand plane from the Chinese model. The Chinese model was more or less a push plane. The Japanese turned it around and made it into a very simple tool with it's got the laminated blade and a body in it that you can adjust to make very fine flat surfaces. So again, I think that was one of the things that happened when they went from the Chinese style, which was painted, into the Japanese Weiyo style, which wasn't painted and it left kind of the naked wood. Why that worked was because the way the plane is set up to burnish as a burnishing surface here. So as you're cutting off the shaving and flattening the surface, you're burnishing and heating that surface up and sealing the oils that are in the wood. So the way the building is constructed with eaves and things that don't stay wet, they get wet and they can drain off, the wood sealed and will last, obviously, for a long time. So again, you can see that they start to move through this. So it wasn't until later that they got, the blacksmiths could come up with making metal that was flat enough and strong enough, like this big boy. This is a Maibiki. This is a big rip saw for when they developed saws and they could get the blacksmiths to make metal that was this thin and flat, that was flexible enough not to snap and break, but was hard enough to sharpen teeth that would cut wood. So this is a rip saw. This is what they would use to rip boards out of a tree. You know, it's a little more accurate and probably a little faster than splitting it and adzing it and doing all that. Today, that adzing work is really a vaulted skill in Japan, especially in a lot of the historical buildings and especially in the tea house carpenters. So all these tools are pretty much a standard working model for different craftsmen. So I would think that you could divide up kind of the craftsmen as house builders, you have temple builders, and then you'd have skiya tea house carpenters. Each one would probably use similar tools. They'd be probably adapted as time went along into much more efficient shapes and uses. Again, the saws that were developed really started to help out developing when they started doing more splicing joints, which we'll look at later. But you know, all this was all pretty much the same. So in just about everything that I've seen, you can find examples of things that were primitive but very practical, up to things that were extremely sophisticated and extravagant. So you could look from something like a Gasho Zakuri house up in Shiragawa-go, up in the Hida Takayama area, which would be very primitive. Those didn't have, most of that whole building was tied together with ropes, right? And they had a ability to design these buildings that they would stand up to the wind and rain and all the heavy snows that they got up there. So these weren't very sophisticated buildings, but some of my favorites because they're so accessible And the primitiveness just shows the work. It's a community effort. It wasn't built by specialists. It was built by farmers and peoples who had done this before and passed on the tradition of everything from getting the lumber and the logs up to getting they go in to rethatch the roofs with all the rice straw and the mathanthia leaves, reeds that they use. So then you get up to something that looks like Nico, where all the Tokugawas were buried. It's one of the most extravagant, over-the-top, sophisticated things I've ever seen. I mean, everything from the building and the layout to the carpentry to the carving to all the lacquer work to the whole thing. So again, you've got the carpenters that do this, but also you've got other groups that come in to finish off the buildings. Everything from the houses to tea houses to that all mostly have clay walls, which are done by the Sakan people, which are the people who do all the clay walls in the Jiraku, which is the clay that they use for making these walls on the bamboo structure. So when you're looking at houses, the book that I showed you before has incredible detailed drawing of everything from foundations up to hafu board designs and roof tile designs and all these different kinds of things which were adapted to different climates that they lived in. So it wasn't a one-man job like we tend to think of here in the modern world. You had people that did different processes and different things, and the head carpenter was the architect and the designer, and these guys are held in really high esteem. It takes a long time to learn all this, even though the joinery is the wood-to-wood connection holds things together, right? And there's 3 or 4 different basic shapes that I want to try to go through to show this, so that when you look at something, you don't see the joinery. The joinery is all hidden on the inside. That's the engineering part of it that holds it together. Usually it's a penetration kind of thing, whether it's a male and female. Sometimes it's 2 pieces the same size. But again, that's what all held it together. Because this guy over here in the picture, he didn't have enough metal to have a metal hammer. He had a wooden mallet hammer. Works okay. A lot of ways of doing this. And as they developed this, the hammer people came on, and all the other specialists started making other different kinds of planes. And then when they got into being able to make the saw blades thin enough to hold up and be practical, then all the saw blades developed with different kinds of teeth. The rip teeth made it much more efficient for getting the lumber out. It was Ioba, which is the standard that we're using today, came about. This is a Ryoba. It has cross-cut teeth and rip teeth. You need both for cutting joinery. This is a professional grade quality saw. It has a metal blade that has to be hammered out and flattened and scraped and tensioned, and I mean, it's a lot of work. It looks really simple, but there's a lot of work that goes into making things simple. Then it has a welded tang on it that goes back in the handle that's much softer. So this is a much harder piece of steel. So when they had the first saws they made like this, they were called anabiki. They had a curved cutting edge with teeth that were more like a rip tooth. They didn't have the kind of teeth we've got now, which is called edome, which Edo, I'm sure, comes from when they moved into Tokyo. And the saw sharpeners came up with a new way of sharpening crosscut teeth that put a little knife edge on the end that gave them very accurate, clean crosscuts. So again, all this technology goes with the advance and the sophistication of the building and the joinery. So, some fairly really simple looking tools. I've got some other books I'll show you that show you some of the joinery. Again, this is the layout tool they use. It has measurements shaku on one side, and it has 2 other scales on the other side, which probably most useful is this kakume scale, which is the front side measurement multiplied by the square root of 2, which gives you the hypotenuse of a right triangle. So that's used in laying out all your hip rafter connections and all those sort of angles. This is like the prototype for a computer. People that are trained in knowing how to use this thing, it's really fantastic to see the way they dance around with this to get the measurements and the accuracy that they need. So again, this is still used. This is the standard size. This one's a stainless steel. Old ones I've heard were made out of copper. So again, this was when they standardized the measurements. I made everybody was working on the same sizes and they could make them all fit together. I know we worked on a Mikoshi probably 10 years ago. That was Mikoshi is a wheeled float that they used for the festivals in Japan. They had like 100 different shops that made parts and brought them all together, and they put them together. And we got invited, a bunch of us here in the Bay Area got invited to make some of the railing parts that went on. So we made our parts and shipped them to Japan, and they were part of the installation on this Mikoshi. And as far as I could tell, there was no nails or metal fasteners. A lot of the frame parts were tied together. But again, we were all measuring the same thing, so it didn't matter where we were. They all would fit together. I'm sure they had to be a little fitting to go together, but generally that was the idea. So with such simple tools, the incredible accuracy that's used. Like I said, this is an older Chinese sumitsubo. It's got the ink pot, which is the subo. It has raw cotton in it with a string that goes through it, and that's your ink line. Plus, this is the pot for your layout tool. So all the lines that were drawn with something like this. This is a much more modern sumitsubo. You got your ink, your sumi ink on your raw cotton. You've got a wheel here that gives you a chalk line. It lines up back here. This is usually one of the projects when you go to your journeyman stage, you carve your own sumitsubo. This one has a crane and a turtle, which is long life and longevity and all those sort of embedded ideas and intentions into what you're doing here. So what it's laid out with is this little piece of bamboo that's been split like a quill pen, sharpened at an edge. That gives you a very fine line when you're drawing with the square. And then the other end has it matched. It's kind of like a brush, so you can write names and mark your waist and stuff with that. So, you've reduced all this to the most simplest ideas and effect that, these are something you make yourself. You didn't make the steel probably, but other than that, you made most of your other tools. So the tools, again, they had great access to fine steel, some of the finest steel in the world at that time, and still probably a fine quality, finest quality steel making into the laminated tools. So when you move beyond the adze and the chona and the yarigana, they got the plane, turned it around. Like I said, Chinese planes were push planes with sticks on the side. This was a pull plane. Originally, they only had the single blade. Later on, they added the secondary chipper blade to help plane when they saw that from Dutch shipbuilders. So all the planing, engineering, and physics that go into this really simple looking tool is pretty much a long-term study to get the perfection out of this. This is still one of the most remarkable hand tools that I know of because of the perfection it requires and just the skill development you can get with such simple tools here. So we're talking about joinery. Again, like I said, a lot of the joinery is simple is better. It goes from very simple to much more sophisticated and extravagant, but the basic mode of the whole thing is the same. The joinery is what connects the pieces. It's not the shapes and how they're carved or painted or not. This is a through mortise and tenon. You can see the tenon sticks through here, and it's got a pin that goes through that locks it into place. That's a standard one way that they are connected. Sometimes you get a double tenon. Instead of making one big tenon, you get two smaller tenons. Still got the key in it, right? That pin holds it together. So, this could be a small thing, which I'll show you smaller applications for this, but it's also in big things. So most of the time when you see something, you'll see two pieces. You might see a plug. Well, that tells you this one is housed because it doesn't come through. So this could be the K to beam on a building with a post. Could be many, many things. But again, it's all the same thing done with those simple tools accurately. So you have mortise and tenon, which is here. You can see this is a 4-shoulder mortise and tenon. Tenon comes through. The other joint that's used a lot is called a bridle joint. Kind of think of it as tenons on the outside with the spline in the middle. You get a lot more binding surface, which again is where these are squeezing together, and that's what holds it together. A lot of times these aren't pinned because the weight of the roof and the gravity would hold it down in a building. But in other applications, you would need to do this. So these are simple shapes. You know, your mortise and tenon, your bridle joint, and your half flap joint. Again, these simple joints are adapted and combined into infinite, well, not infinite, but mind-boggling display of uses. Right. So this simple joint I'm going to show you later when we talk about the temple building. I've got a bracket system here that we built in a workshop with Richard Wyborg, who's a local guy, an old friend of mine, and he's an expert on Chinese and Japanese bracket systems. If you're interested in that kind of thing, I would recommend going to his website. His website, I think it's Richard Wyborg, WIBORG.com. He's got, I don't know, 5 or 6 scale models of all these brackets. I know he was doing a 20th scale model of a Chinese temple with all the brackets in it. I mean, so he's a very expert on that. He actually brought over Mr. Ma a number of years ago, and we did some bracket systems with him. So it was interesting working with the Chinese carver. He's not a carver. He's the guy that's in charge of all the rebuilding of the temples in China. They're rebuilding them as tourist destinations, not necessarily with religious overtones so much these days, but you know, the quality and the work on those is really extravagant. So he's been to China a lot. He knows a lot about that, and the history of how those brackets evolved is really a fascinating engineering thing when you realize this was a very crucial part in the development of the temple construction. So if you follow that from the Indian modes, like you see some of the temples in Japan that are old Indian style, you'll notice the bracket systems are much more simple. When you get into later the Chinese styles that came in, they get more complicated and much more sophisticated. So we'll look at that in a minute. So again, you got temple builders which have their own parameters. They're building. There's hardly any straight lines in those buildings. They're big, so there's a lot of antithesis going on with some of the posts and angles and subtle things that we don't really recognize just looking at them on a pedestrian level. It's kind of like Greek temples. Those things have a lot of antithesis in them so that they look like they're staying flat when actually there's some slight curves and things that make the proportions look at right. So how they figured all that out, you know, to me, that's one of the amazing things, because again, it was a mind thing, and thinking is out. And I'm sure, you know, failure, collapse, prevention, and all those kind of things after a while. I know that Richard was on a PBS show, The Secrets of the Forbidden City, and they did a scale model of a temple, and they put it on an earthquake table and shook it to like a 10 point something, and the building rocked all over, but it didn't fall down. So what we saw from that was that when Mr. Ma was here, we were all kind of trained to do the Japanese mode, which is these squeezy tight joints, and he didn't like that because we were making them too tight, because the Chinese things were made a little looser, not loose, but loosey-goosey, but a little more flexible, because the joinery itself absorbs the motion of the building. So when something's rigid, it can't flex, right? So when you got a whole matrix of joints holding a building together, then the whole building kind of flexes with the earthquake or the wind without before things snap and break. When you look at, say, an English building or a Western building, they're built with this real rigid system. And, that works in England because they don't have earthquakes there. But again, it's one of those adaptations to the environment and the terrain that you live in. So the Japanese really tightened up their production and their construction, and they've engineered it out so their buildings hold up under earthquake situations. So those joints, again, you find them in all the different styles. So house building, again, could go from something very simple and practical to some very extravagant houses that were built for the samurai and for the merchants and all those kind of design things. Then you're bringing in, all the other craftsmen that do making the shoji and making the tatami and doing the plaster work and the Fusuma and the Fusuma painters, and I don't know, it's endless. It goes on. So again, rank and privilege pretty much determined how extravagant you could do. There were laws on that, I think, on the books. So those simple joints show up in a lot of things. That one simple shape, right? This is more or less the male component that would fit into a hole that would be the mortise. What that basic shape is changes shapes and does a lot of different things. It can change from a regular shape like this into half a dovetail shape. All right. This goes into a joint called the shitaji kama. This joint, again, where does all this start from? Well, the earliest one that I've found out about all this is, get it apart. This joint was found in a book that I found that was in Chinese furniture in the time of Confucius. This is one of the more ingenious joints. It's a through mortise and tenon that has half a dovetail in it that fits into the half a dovetail here. So as this goes in and locks down into that crotch, you tighten up the compression against the end grain with these two bypassing wedges. So as you drive them in, they get thicker and put more compression this way, and it locks in. This is the tightest, most stable right angle joint that I know of. The other way, again, would be to put a pin in it. Right? But again, this joint is so simple and so refined, and it was found in furniture in the time of Confucius, a long time ago. Right? It's used in Japanese construction. I know you'll see this when you go through a torii gate, and you'll have the upright pieces, and this comes out into another one, and you see keys sticking out like that. There's something going on in here. There's a bunch of different configurations inside here that lock all this together with the wedges. But when you see these wedges like that, what's going on the inside? There's some tricky stuff there that holds all that together. That's a simple single. So it's used in house construction. This would be like studs that would hook up between the mud seal plate and the Cato beam. Between the posts, these nukis would run in between here, and this is what puts shear into the building, because you're not putting plywood paneling as a shear panel like the balloon framing that we do. So again, it's all integrated in each one. One joint doesn't hold it together, but it's this incredible matrix of knowing how all this stuff comes together. This is but it's two pieces, right? Two pieces that are the same, that go together with opposite direction for the dovetails. Right? Looks like this. You got a hole that goes through both ways. So this one comes in and locks down right there. Right? And this one comes through from the other way. So again, these things would be put together. This would be inside the wall. They would weave bamboo and put mud on it as the shotgun would do is the plaster wall here. So, that's part of the stability of the timber frame structure in the Japanese mode. So when you're building houses like that, again, they can go from simple to very refined and extravagant. That's one way of building these things with different kinds of joints. Mortise and tenons can come through again. mortise and tenon. This has wedges that are driven in the end. Again, the whole key is that the compression's against the end grain of the mortise so you don't split the wood. That's one of the things that the Japanese really have focused on. That's the style and what makes their Japanese, their construction methods hold up to all the stresses that they've got. One of the other interesting joints for mortise and tenon is this joint, which is called a held joint. It's a house mortise and tenon with wedges in it. So what happens inside of here, again, you got very fine layout here. Let me go back to this guy for a minute. So what you've got here is something that looks like that. It's called the held joint because once it goes together, you can't get it apart. It's held to fix it, right? So what happens is when you see this part, your mortise and tenon are here, so when you drive the tenon down, you've got wedges that are calculated so that when you drive this down, it won't come apart because the wedges are in there. It makes it really clean and really tight. But if you don't get the wedges and all these in the right shape, then it won't fit. It doesn't tight, doesn't go down. It's too loose. You can't really fix it. So that's why they call it the held joint. So in house construction, something happened here, Peter. I don't know. We lost. Oh, there we go. Back. Okay. Real technical problem. There we go. So house construction has its own carpenters. You can see that even within this book, you can see we're unplugged again. There we go. You can see inside. You can see these. This is inside the timber framing of the roof. Even with really sophisticated houses, they still use a lot of logs and things on the inside that are hidden. And working these geometries out, straight things, another developing skill, which is really something to kind of. I don't know. Hold on a minute. So here again, you can see here's the kind of the timber frame I was talking about with the Nukis, and then they got bamboo lath here with all the mud put in it, right? And that's what the sakan does. They come back and put in many layers as it dries out. It's a whole trade of knowing how to do this, and they put other things in it to make it work. Let's see, I have one more here I wanted to show you in this book. Again, here you can see we're starting to look at house framing. It's on a rock. Usually, the Japanese houses are usually built up off the ground. Chinese buildings usually had a lot more stone floors and were built on the ground. Korean houses were up off the ground, but they had like heating vents underneath so they could heat their houses. The Japanese didn't do that. They just had their fire pit, which was raised up off the ground for ventilation. These houses were built more or less for hot summer, not for the cold winters that they had to. So again, you see this book has a lot of the old manuals that were in here. These manuals weren't written out probably till the 1700s. It's got floor plans and different designs. It's really an incredible book for house building. I mean, you can see here's some kind of foundation, traditional foundation pool. They didn't have concrete, right? Packed dirt, packed mud, rocks on the end, mud seals to get the house up above the dirt so it didn't rot out. Most temples were built up on big plinths. They got them up off the ground, and it gave them, that's what's part of the longevity of that made the buildings last. Their idea was that, they were using old growth timbers at that point because that was the virgin forest they had. And as it seems like as they would build in a situation, they would cut all the trees down. So when they went to move somewhere else, they moved to where there were other trees and other options for getting their materials. So it wasn't until after they started developing saws and those kind of more sophisticated tools that they developed the splicing joints that they could extend the length of joints. So usually the joints are either end-to-end joints or 90-degree joints. All right. So when you get to the corner of a house, you got a three-way connection going on here. So you can see you've got two half laps and you've got four bridle joints here overlapping that hold this corner together. So this could be the corner, of a building. You have your end of a temple with all the carvings and stuff on it. That doesn't affect what the joinery is too much. There's a lot of ways to connect all these together, but again, that would be one of the more simpler ways. So house construction goes on and on. Again, some of the machiai, the houses that were built in the for the merchants that ended up being the guys with all the money. They squeezed out all the samurai who became useless after they couldn't be samurais anymore. That's a really interesting development. The other development, I read a couple of books about how the wood industry changed from early on when the emperor owned everything and the temples owned all the everything, and then as it developed later on, the communities took over the forest, and that was when their wood industry developed into its own kind of business and helped develop the forestry industry. So a lot of these things developed along as people's economic situation needed to change, or they took advantage of different political activities. So we talked about some of the house construction. The other special builders are the skia style builders, or the the tea house carpenters. Again, you go from primitive, practical in a tea house to some really extravagant, very sophisticated things. All the sophisticated, flashy things were kind of known as show-in style. They developed through the aristocracy, where they could kind of show off all their riches and their fine tea utensils and famous Chinese tea bowls and all that stuff. So around the 1500s, Senriku came in with another idea, and he was building so-on style tea houses, which were much more rustic and much more country. It seemed like at that point the intensity of the economy and all of the administrative things, these people went built their tea rooms and their tea gardens so they could get back into the country and be closer to nature. So he came up with wabi sabi, which was pretty much the opposite of the Showan style, which everything was very elegant and finished and complete. He went in for more natural materials and using his favorite tea bowls were like Korean rice bowls, not the real fancy gold leaf stuff. It was all back to nature, much more simpler and unfinished. So it looks unfinished, right? But in a tea house, there's a lot of logs that are used in it, and it's not all square lumber. There is some, but not too much. The thing that really sets it off is all the log work. So here again, you can see, because you got two rounds coming together, you've got a lot of carving, and it's much more sculptural in terms of what the effect is. So again, it looks very casual, but it's not that casual to do. There's a lot of techniques and things that are built into learning how to do all this. Again, to me, I saw it as sculpture, and it was really something really intriguing. So, tea houses, skia style residential areas, those are all built that way too. I mean, again, a lot of the tea houses are very small, maybe a couple of tatami mats. I know Riku had one that was 1.5, so it was a very intimate, closed off area. It wasn't It wasn't a pavilion for looking at the views. Those were other kind of buildings. So there were different styles, different schools who all had different placements of things and what they required their own thing. But again, most of this construction was done with raw materials and logs and bamboo and mud. It wasn't a lot of refined finishes and things. So in looking at how you would treat, say, a post, let me have that other piece there, Jason. So if you're looking at this being a post in a tea house, it would set on a rock, right? Carved to fit on a rock, very sculpture, very beautiful, really sexy. This would be the log. This could be maybe a floor beam. So what holds this together, again, is a mortise and tenon. So you would have something look like this. You've got your floor beam, you've got a haunch that's carried inside, and what holds the thing together is this is a house sliding dovetail, right? You got a mortise and tenon that's cut with this shape on, makes it a dovetail, which holds it in there. So that goes into the pocket at the bottom, slides up, that holds it in there. What holds the weight is this tenon, the stub tenon on the bottom. So as that goes into the pocket, that keeps this from coming loose. Right. So as this goes back into the, gotta get that going. Precision fit stuff here, right? So again, the problem with this is the layout and how you get all your things lined. You get a grid system lined up on things that aren't in a grid system, so you have to know how to construct that. So again, this goes back in there. That holds the weight. You've got these these keys that are offset that drive in on an angle, and that keeps this from pulling out. Of course, within a building, it's not going to pull out even with like in an earthquake, because all this would work together, right? So you got this kind of joint that works in this situation, because this is tea house construction. If you were building it in a regular house, it would probably look more like this, because you'd have a square post. It would set on a rock or a stone plinth. You get it up off the ground, because again, you never have this in contact with the ground. I mean, I think they found that out. They looked at old archaeological digs of Jomon things that had posts that were stuck down in the ground, and the posts rotted off, and they could find the post holes and calculate all the stuff they could find from that. But again, to make the post last longer, they kept this up off the ground. So again, this is pretty much the same joint, right? Same kind of thing. You got your house sliding dovetail that goes in. So again, the sophistication in these joinery is all changed depending on what the intention of the builder is. Again, this is trying to take you back into something that's more natural, and you don't feel so much inside outside. And then this is a much more sophisticated thing where everything would be planed and square and very true and accurate. So again, all these simple constructions go through many changes depending on what they're needed to do. But again, it's a very simple construction, but not a simple process. So, I mean, again, you're laying out something that's a big building. You got a lot of things to consider, and how they all tie together and what keeps them together and how all this is. So, again, it's like a big puzzle. Still a big puzzle, but, that's why it takes so long to learn how to do all this. So, the joints may look simple, and they are simple, and they're very simple combinations that give you a lot of much more complicated and much more elegant situations to construct your building with. Some of the other joints, this is another joint that would be on a mud seal. I don't know if you can even see this. Let me get the other camera. Okay. This is a gooseneck splicing joint. I can't get the whole thing in at one time. This would be like a floor beam or something to be connected. You can see you've got this goose chick that fits in. So again, you got a tenon, but they've changed it and put this hammer names for this, which fits in, and that's what holds this from pulling out this way. You've got haunches that set on, so this would be setting on the foundation level. One of the things that's different about Japanese construction is that they maintained all these joints in practical use because of the buildings that they've had to maintain. You know, and the other thing too, again, the Western construction would tend to put a lot of the joinery on top of the post, which really weakened a lot of the pieces that were in there. So the Japanese would never put a splicing joint on top of a post like the Westerners would do. But again, you can see, you know, the kind of construction that we've got here. You know, this is there. There's no bolts. There's no nails. When you put metal into wood, you start to get an electromotive rusting thing going on. So what happens is that the metal rusts out, right? You got wood to wood. You've got the right kind of wood that lasts. You know, it's been treated right. They have a definite much more a much more pragmatic approach to treating their wood. Their forestry is much more managed and sophisticated than our Western industrial lumber providers. They really take care of it. You see a lot of they've taken the branches off 40 or 50 feet up, so when they cut the tree down a couple hundred years, they got clear lumber. They don't have a lot of knots in it, right? They cut the wood down, they measure. Like when they do East Age, 20 years they rebuild that. After, you know, the first 12 years of that, I think, is dealing with the lumber, cutting it down, drying it out. They soak it in the river for a couple of years to wash out a lot of the sap and the things that are in there. So all this extra preparation work that they put in there, they found out that's what really makes the building last longer, right? You're not going to build a building to last 100 years out of lumber that only took 40 years to build, because it doesn't have the quality and the integrity that it would take to last that long. There's a lot of environmental effects on the wood other than just the wood, the rotten sort of things like that. So there's all kinds of mortise and tenons. Here's one that's a small model of a mud sill corner, right? So this would be the corner, and this has a miter in the top. Would have a mortise and tenon, and a post would come up off the top of this. You got more sophisticated, then there would be a lot more cuts and things inside here where you wouldn't see the ingrain, which you don't see anyway. But you know, it's just the point of, you know, doing a better job and thinking it out a little further. It's really quite amazing how much detail and variation there are in things that need to be substantial. So if you're looking at, say, a timber frame house, this could kind of be, this would be sitting on a rock, right? These would be your floor beams. How those are put together are with mortise and tenon that have an overlap so you can get a corner. Right, so you're looking at this, it's square this way. This would be where the floor would lay. So what happens is when it goes through, you got one on top and one on the bottom. Again, the tenon is what holds it apart. You got the little haunch that carries the wood. This goes together, and maybe it would have pins that would hold these from coming out. Again, this would be pinned into the foundation level. You come up through the building, you get to the top, you got like your half flap joints and other joints at the top, so you've got your K beams for your ridge, for your rafters to lay on. So all this is proportional. There's whole systems of very exact proportions depending on what kind of building it is, how big it is. Usually it's determined on the number of tatamis that are in the room. Will give you the proportions for everything from your beams and your trims and all those things. So, you know, to really be a trained Japanese carpenter, there's a lot of mental work that goes into this too, besides just building, just being able to cut joints and plain wood. There's really a lot of real deep study here and understanding all this and understanding the flow of the energy that goes through the building and people living in it and the situation that the building creates that you live in. I mean, you live in an old farmhouse, that might have a dirt floor in part of it, and they might have part of it where the livestock went, and then you go into the raised wooden area where the fire pit was and where the people lived was up off the ground. So again, it depends on the culture that each region seemed to have its own kind of design and requirements because of the environment. So one other thing I want to show you here before we take some questions is thank you, Jason Foster, my last apprentice here. This is a bracket system. I think we did this with Richard Wyborg. We did a class in this a couple of years ago. It was really incredible. This is Chinese stuff. When you look at Japanese temples and you see a lot of round beams and posts, that's Chinese influence. They do a lot of trouble to get all these round things. So this is a bracket system. Again, can be a very complicated system. You've got all your purlin. This would be a purlin. This would be the wall right in the building. You've got this bottom base, these cantilever pieces that go up and out supporting each other, and all the purlins and the rafters would be round. A lot of trouble to make these things round. There's a whole process of going through taking a square piece. You square it out first. You see that other round one? This is one that's in process. I don't know if you can see this or not. Here we go. So you can see the end of this, maybe. There's grids on here, right? So you've got your quadrants and you lay all this out and it gives you lines and you work this down from a square into a rounder thing with a plane that has that curve in it. You just don't start planing it. You got a very rigid lineup system to make these things all round and all the same. You know what I mean? They'd make these parts up. They were like the original prefabricators. They'd make up 100 of these parts and 100 of that part, and then they'd put the whole thing together. But again, you can see it's a very thought out process, for the accuracy. So again, this would be your purlin. You have another purlin that lapped on this one that came out. You can keep adding these things on to build them out. So the whole idea here for this was to extend this part out where the rafters would come out to get it away from the edge of the building, which would have mud walls. They were trying to keep the rafters way out here to keep the water away from the wall. Sometimes on those big temples, these things cantilever out like 15 feet. Some of them, you see, they didn't have it figured out right, and they had to put a post on the outside to help support the weight out there. They didn't, they did it by knowing. They tried this, they tried that, and again, it's really interesting when you went to Totoji in the back there, they have like 4 or 5 different scale models of the buildings that were there that have been burned down, and they've rebuilt them. Each time they did it a little different. But again, how they laid all this out and thought it all out beforehand is where the main guys came in. So anyway, got the round purlins, not easy to do. And then you've got all these little pieces like this that are cupped. You see it's cupped, that fits the radius of the round pieces that go in there. This is one of those simple half laps. Excellently done. And all these parts, all these pieces, again, there's a little stub tenon, right, that fits into that little pocket right there. That's what holds that on there, the weight of this. So there's nothing holding this on here but gravity. I mean, you got this big building with all this timber and gravity. Then you got the roof on the top, which would be probably a clay roof, clay lining with the clay tiles on top. So it's all that weight on top. That's one of the good parts, and that's one of the bad parts, because when this thing gets shaken, it's that momentum this far off the top. So, I mean, again, this would have a pin in the bottom, stub tenon, holding it on there. It looks very flimsy. Again, you have to realize this is all tied together. One little thing looks really rickety and maybe not so substantial, but when it's all tied together this way and that way with this stuff on here, you can see. So again, you've got, this is another set right here. Right? There's another little cup that sits on there. This fits here, right? All these are very simple parts, but they got to be very accurately cut. So here's another piece, right? There's a half flap under there. This is a little piece here, Morrison tin, a little half flap. All this is cut out with chisels. Right? It's all handwork here. This fits on here, goes right there. Excuse me. They could put another level on here to keep extending it out that much further. They could come back and do a cross. They could go another one depending on what it was. So all these would be the same. The scale would depend on how big the building was. In each period, it changed in sophistication. And as their engineering and their expertise grew, it got more complicated and stranger. So this is a really simple one. When you get to the corner where you'd have a hip rafter in here, then it gets really crazy. Again, the joints are all fairly easy to cut, but it's understanding the visualization of how those 3D things go together and that they all got to be the same size. Again, they have a bunch of guys making 1,000 of these to go in the temple. Who knows? It could be that many. But again, all these things fit. They're all curved. These little curves are cut to fit in there, and it's just the detail of doing this demo with him was such an eye-opening thing. I mean, even like this little cut here, this isn't a round cut. There's a whole process of laying out these angled little cuts instead of just making a round one. If you see a round one, your eye kind of just goes around it. But when you see this with the facets in it, it stops you and makes you look at this a little more. Again, this could be 50 feet in the air and you wouldn't see it. So who's ever going to know, right? I don't know, but it's the way they would do things. So, again, even with all this complicated, I mean, if you've been up to Nikko where all the Tokugawas are, there's bracket systems in some of those buildings that your eyes can't even focus on what all the pieces are because they're all painted and striped and lacquered, and it's really unbelievable. The dedication that these craftsmen have to be able to pull off something like this. So again, when you go into this, we're just kind of all over the place, but if you were in Japan being trained on this, you would find a path that would take you either to temple building, or you'd be a tea house carpenter, or you'd be a house carpenter, which, again, they've all got their own skills and techniques and tools that, have come down to them. That they learn by doing it and watching and working their way up through the system. And that's kind of how the system has survived. And, now they're, I think they put a little more modern educational function into all this. But again, to learn to control all your tools and your techniques and learning the joints and learning the procedures of all this and learn about all the wood. It takes a long time, and it's a lifelong learning situation. And somebody who's spent my whole adult life doing this, I really found that it was so fulfilling. Again, it's an endless process because it just keeps going. It's so deep. Because all the human intention that's been put into this. So I hope I haven't skumped or jumped around too much that got you a little confused, but I'm just trying to show you the ubiquity parts of all these things that are just really ingenious. That's just in the structural things. Where all the really sophisticated joinery probably shows up more is on some of the interior work and all the splicing joints and the neat tricks on the inside with the joinery that, aren't the structural parts, but are the really pretty parts that came in some of this really extravagant kind of things. I mean, there's a whole probably 100 different kinds of end-to-end joints that would have everything from just a pretty surface to some real structural qualities built into the shapes of the pieces that you're interlocking. So again, comes back to having that aptitude to do it, but also it takes in tool makers, it takes in the carpenters, it takes in, the mud people, it takes in all the other people. Then you got the shoji makers and all the people on the inside doing all the stuff. So, it's a big thing. I mean, there's a lot of really good information if you're interested in this. Like I said, for the brackets, Richard Weiborg's website's really fantastic. The book I showed you was fantastic. If you're interested in, this book is, I can't see it in the light there, but it's got, let's get this in. This book has a lot of, there you go. This book's all in Japanese, but it's got all kinds of drawings for simple to complex. I mean, all these layouts, there's bracket systems in there I just showed you. Just incredible. All the carving work that's done, doors, gates, moans with the roof over the top, right? I mean, a lot of incredible design books here. The other one that I had that I was going to show you, that I think really makes a lot of this accessible, is this book, the Complete Japanese Joinery book. It's two books put together. I worked on the first book, which was just joinery. It's showing you different configurations that are in the house. It kind of gives you an idea of where they go. There are a lot of picture books that just show you the joints, but they don't really show you where they're used. So when you look at this book, a lot of this is laid out in terms of the tools and how it's all constructed and where the joints are used, right? So, for reference, this one is really, it's got a lot of stuff in it, a lot of information, a lot of incredible design things, a lot of techniques on how all this is done. Again, you got complicated one I showed you there. Just had two going in. There's 4 ways to interlock all this together. It's really, it's all in here. So anyway, if I made you any bit curious, that's what I was trying to do today. And I could go on, but I think we need to take some questions. If anybody's got questions?
Yeah, we got some questions.
Okay, let's have some questions here. While he's doing that, I got one thing I wanted to show you that I found I was really intrigued by. I don't know, I forgot where I got this picture. Hope you can see that. It's some carpenters, temple carpenters. You see that big pile of stuff behind them? That's all temple posts. So you can see in this picture, these things are in a hexagon shape before they're rounded off. So there's this big splicing joint that they're squeezing together in this post that must be at least 3 feet in diameter. So, I mean, if you go to Totoji, in these temples, I mean, you got to go to the Takanaka Tool Museum. You go to Japan, you don't go to the Takanaka Tool Museum, you miss something. That place is really a treasure, right? So there's the joint that they were making, and here's a little minor, smaller piece that I made that shows you what those pieces actually look like. Except this is maybe 1 inch in diameter, and theirs is 3 feet. So it's a lot more work. But see, you got a lot of binding surface. This piece is what they were doing in that picture, is putting that together. Then it locks in, holds itself together. So it's really a strong joint in a lot of directions. So, for a post, you may not get 40 or 50 foot long pieces that were 3 feet in diameter and clear. There's one in the Takanaka Tool Museum that's a mind boggler. If you ever go there, it's in the main entry way when you come in. So you can see it at the bottom on the ground, and then you can go upstairs and look at it from the from the overhead view, and you're right in the size of where all this bracket thing is going on. I mean, it's really such a sculptural piece of work. It's really fantastic. So again, I can't say enough about the Takanaka Tool Museum. One of the guys that I got to study and know Tomoya Endo, who's known as Yutaiki. His father was Miyano Tetsukanotsuki, which was the emperor the Emperor Sawmaker. So they just had a big exhibit there of all his work, and Utaiki is included in part of that work because he was the son that took over the business after his father retired, and we got to work with him. I helped bring him over here a couple of times, and he was here for some other things, and we got into making laminating tools. I've got a couple students that actually, one student went to work with him in Japan for a while, who's got a forge, and he's making some traditional tools. But working with this guy, again, was one of those people who was like the icing on the cake for me. His family came from 13th century sword makers, and they ended up being saw makers. So again, it was a transition of being able to make steel that flat and flexible and hard enough to keep an edge and not break. You look at a saw and you think, oh, okay, simple looking. But again, anytime it's simple looking, there's a lot of stuff in there that doesn't show up that you find out when you start digging into it a little deeper. Okay.
So we have Bonnie Baruki.
Okay.
And Bonnie should be live on mic. Bonnie, you want to ask your 2 questions? You can't hear her.
What's your question? You got it written down?
Yeah. Let's see. That's funny because I think Bonnie is unmuted. So Bonnie asks, what are the primary woods used? That's number 1.
Good idea. That usually in Japan is cedars and cypresses. They have abundance of those trees in Japan that we don't have here. They're mostly like Port Orford cedar, which would be like hinoki. They have sugi and a bunch of other different kinds of cedars from different parts. There's Kiso cedar. There's cedars from different places that are all valued for different reasons. But again, the cedars and the cypresses are really a fine-grained, flexible wood that's pretty much resistant as wood can be against environmental factors and insects. They also use for timber, for their temples and things. Sometimes they're made out of elm. They don't use a lot of the other hardwoods and things, which we tend to think of as more structurally sound. But again, the flexibility of the wood in the joinery is what they're looking at for the longevity of the wood. Interior stuff, they use everything for their tansus and cabinets. There's everything from kiyaki, which again is like an elm, a hardwood. They use persimmon wood sometimes. They use a kitty wood, which is a paulownia, which is like balsa wood, which doesn't seem like much, but it really is a good wood for storage boxes. And a lot of the tansus that hold kimonos, they use them out of the kiri wood because it doesn't have sap in it that bleeds into it. Again, the process of cutting and drying this wood and then seasoning it again, it's something that they have perfected down. I mean, we're using lumber that was, could be 6 months old or a year old. They've got wood there that I've seen in lumber yards that they've been aging for 30 years before they use it. So again, they've got a different mindset that we have. And I mean, again, some of these older traditional schools are not up to date with the new modern IKEA stuff, but there's still people that in Japan that appreciate, handcrafted tableware and bowls and band things, not just plastic throwaway disposable stuff. A lot of that there too. Again, there's a lot of everything there, but again, there are these rich veins of this tradition that are really inspiring and enriching.
Bonnie, you with us now?
Yo.
Okay. Bonnie, your mic is live, and your next question was, I don't know what's wrong with her mic, but also in the community forests, how was the wood milled? Was it milled for specific carpentry techniques?
Good question. Like I said before, there are a couple of books that I read about that. Quick answer on that is, well, the trees are fell down by loggers. They developed that into private companies after a while. The Satoyama, which is the community woodlot or the community common ground that they could all use, those were all highly controlled by, first it was the government, then the temples, and then it became part of the economy of the communities. As they developed, they didn't have power machines, so all the milling, like we think of, wasn't really done. It was done with splitting. It was done with adzing, yarigana, those kind of things. I mean, there are old pictures I've seen of them taking a wide plank and maybe cutting a board out of it by chiseling a quarter of an inch groove in it to get a board out of it. Later, they got those big saws, like I showed you. That's kind of where these guys came in. These guys were the sawyers. They were the ones that cut up the wood when they finally got into a situation where there may have been something like a lumber yard we think of today. I read a book about the last guy that sawed lumber by hand, which they really like because they don't like wood that's been gone through a circular saw because it heats up and case hardens the wood, which doesn't make it good. Today they use band saws mostly, right? The old days they sawed it by hand. Nothing, it was all straight. So the guy said, well, how'd you get so good? He said, well, if you saw out a board and it's more than 1/8 of an inch in depth and thickness over the board, you don't get paid for the board. Well, that's because the guy that was going to finish it had to finish it with a hand plane. And if the thing was big and little, it was too much work, and he didn't, there was no reason to make something that rough. So, again, this evolved as machines came in. I think they ended up having early water mills that ran some saw blades later on, but that wasn't for a long time. So, again, this was all a human-powered investment for the most part.
Any follow-up questions, Bonnie?
Good questions, though. A lot of research, there's books on this. Again, it's very interesting to see how it changed the economy of the country folks when they started taking control of their own resources, and they protect them. I mean, that's part of their, they're hooked up with nature. It's not they're going to clear cut something that, they don't do that. When they do that, they replant. They're thinking long term, a couple hundred years ahead.
Okay, our next question is from Brendan Pang. Brendan, hit your unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I just first like to say that I think that all these tendons and joints that you've been showing us is like really interesting to see. It's like a lot more intricate than I thought.
Yeah.
My question is like because of how intricate these joints are, like especially with the hell joint that you showed us earlier, how often do these joinery need to be repaired and maintained?
Well, that's part of what they would choose a joint to be used in a certain specific situation would be on how vulnerable it would need to be replaced in 100 years or 500 years. I mean, again, you're talking about some of these older temples, that are 1,000 years, 1,200 years old. Some of that can all be taken apart and replaced. The hell joint, where that would be used, probably wouldn't be used in a timber frame situation. It might be used more in furniture or something on that way. So again, that wouldn't really be something you could take apart and fix. Again, that's more on the interior thing, which I didn't really get too much into, but there's a lot more tricky stuff going on with that because, again, you're dealing with things that don't have to hold up a snow load or have to take a wind load or those kind of earthquake proof things. So that's where the joiner really got much more sophisticated, is on the interior of the houses and where the joinery and things were. Like take this joint. I mean, you look at this joint, You can't, let me go back here just a minute. This would be a splicing joint on a piece of molding, something maybe around the top of the room, and all you would see would be maybe that. Well, what was really going on, it was two shorter pieces that look kind of like this. Right, again, so you got a male and female. They're not the same piece, but again, you've got splines and cogs that all hold this together. And again, you need some sharp tools to be able to be this accurate. So as these go together, they lock in, and you've got a key in the top. Again, it's offset, which holds all this together. But, you know, they never show you anything but this little gap right there, even if you could see where the little teeny gap was. That was part of the whole trick of being able to hide all this. All the neat stuff is all hidden. You can't really see it. So, you know, when you get into the interior things, then you get a lot more sophisticated configuration. You see that dovetail thing right there. Yeah. This joint, again, is one of those really tricky things. I don't know who came up with this idea. So this joint would be used where if you got a beam across the top, and then you're hanging down. This would have tracks where the shoji would go overhead. And then in between here would be where the rama goes in. So what would hold this on could be maybe a held joint. But what this one is you've got a dovetail, right, that fits down into an oversized dovetail slot. And then what takes up that gap is these little keys that go in the side. Right, so once you got that in place, that holds this from coming loose overhead, and you can trim those off. And this in here is where all the rama would go. Right, so again, when they came into much more sophisticated designs on the interior, you know, they started coming up with stuff like this. I mean, that to me is the real ingenious way of using a dovetail. I never really, you know, thought that much about, you know, what doing a dovetail that way. But, you know, really it's an ingenious insight these guys have gotten. I mean, you know, these guys, this is their life. So they're really, you know, really tuned into how they can, you know, do this sophisticatedly. That answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, next up is going to be Keiko. And let's see. Let's find that. Keiko, if you can unmute yourself. Let me see. Here she is.
Okay.
Hi, Jay. This is Keiko.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm just wondering, somewhere I read the article, well, actually documentary in Japan, that they cut down so many trees to satisfy the construction needs that they're running short. And environmentally, they're kind of apparently. So is Japan importing some of the woods that or you talked about, or are they all satisfying their demand within Japan?
Well, I think, you know, as the economy went through big times and bad times, they were using a lot more lumber, but I think it came to their attention that they, you know, they weren't taking care of their forests, and again, they changed their attitude. A lot of the forestry started not having. They had lumber, but their prices were higher than some of the cheaper imports that they're buying from us. I mean, they bought our forest. They went down to Honduras and bought forests, and they just cut them down there because it's not homeland to them. I think it goes back and forth. I know that was when they're they've come up with a plan that when they redo a temple or something, they're using all Japanese wood to keep it more authentic. They're not using lumber from Brazil or Taiwan or from Canada. They're trying to go back to actually keep it authentic. I know there was a great show, one of the a company that excuse me, did a lot of restoration, and that was what he was really getting to get back on the board with, was that they were using a lot of lacquer, but the lacquer they were using was from China. So what he did was they got the government to invest in all these lacquer trees that were forests that had been left vacant because they were buying cheaper stuff from overseas. So he got them to go to the point of like, well, that's a slippery slope, because if you're building something from traditional Japanese point of view, you wouldn't use Chinese lacquer or Canadian lumber. So I don't know. That goes back and forth. I know their lumber is a lot more expensive for them, even because they take so much better care of it. So the quality of it would probably be something that would affect where that lumber came from. But a lot of the lumber yards I was looking at the other day on the internet, they have all kinds of Japanese stuff, very select, but they also have, teak from Burma, and they have Honduras mahogany and stuff like that. That probably is more for furniture makers than for, things that were timber frame, where you need bigger pieces. But, again, that's a good question. I'm sure that's something they're dealing with. But again, they have a much better grasp on the environment, than I think our wood industry does. So that I can't specifically answer, but I think there is some back and forth on that. A lot of it has to do with the price, and a lot of the, I know, Doug fir and stuff like that from the West Coast in Canada, that's a lot cheaper than what they would use. The good stuff that we keep in Japan. I'm sure it goes back and forth. But you see Japan, it still seemed to me, you might see some little patches of some clear cut, but there's still, I don't know, a huge amount of Japan covered by trees. So I think they'll have they're using up all ours, then they'll have theirs when they get ready for it. So, they're thinking down the road 100 years or so.
Thank you, Jay.
Yes, good to talk to you.
I got a question, Jay.
Okay, Peter, what is there?
Well, it strikes me that having worked in home remodeling myself in the past, it strikes me that your joinery construction takes a lot more skill and training than stick building a typical home here from wood. And I wonder if you could compare, not only from the construction site point of view, but from the production to the conversion of raw logs into usable lumber and the manufacture of tools. Could you compare the two kinds of home building in terms of their, their suitability to places where you don't have machine shops and factories with nationwide distribution, kind of the whole alternative technology and development question?
Well, to me, that would be, I know my own situation. It's finding the right customers who want to invest in this kind of intention. Western stick framing, really simple. I mean, the industries, we're looking at industrial stuff, it's all fabricated. There's chop saws, there's no joinery. You got metal nail guns. Not saying that's a bad thing, but it's a long way from the care and craftsmanship that you would get in a timber frame house. There are people around still doing that. That's kind of who we're training our people to work for. And, again, I never really found my audience was working for people that Did work in a few track homes, doing a few finer things, but that's not really the market for all this because it's a different mindset on something. You know, I mean, a lot of the old log cabins and old timber frame buildings that were, you know, they have a different feel about them. They give you a different environmental impact when you're living around that kind of a thing as opposed to 2x4s that got sheetrock nailed on them. Not that there's anything wrong with sheetrock and 2x4. It's much more invested with the craftsmanship. The time and the intention that's put into that shows up in ways that are hard to quantify with money. So again, it's finding the right customers to keep you busy so you can do more work. So, you know, there are a lot of you know, there's North American Timber Framers Guild trains a lot of people. They do a lot of historic kind of things. I know now the traditional buildings, you know, a lot of them been modernized and stuff. Still a lot of, you know, like Amish timber framers going on. I know the president of Kezuroukai, Carl Barris, he's down in Santa Cruz. He builds incredible barns and big structures and tea houses. I mean, you know, there's a lot of those jobs. There's not that many people that can do them, and you know, the more people understand about them, you know, and I mean, the prices of houses these days. I don't know why you can't build a better house for that amount of money. You know, so again, it depends on the customers, the clients, depends on, you know, having the whole setup to do all that. You need different engineers to build a timber frame building than you would something you'd shoot through the building department that's all 2x4s and CDX and that kind of stuff. So, you know, it's a different mindset on who would want that kind of living situation. But the skill and stuff it takes to build with joinery, and especially the Japanese style. You know, there's a few of those in this country. I know Larry Allison just built some incredible thing down in Woodside that they worked on for over 10 years. And, you know, a lot of people got to do a lot of good work because he spent big bunches of money for it. And, you know, that really gave people a lot more insight into how to build things that big. Of course, you don't find many customers that can spend over $100 million on. I mean, this wasn't one house. This was a whole big complex. I mean, it was over. That's Mr. Ellison for you. So, you know, normal people. You know, there's a lot of, you know, like I said, I've worked on a few more or less modern stick frame track homes that I added something, a post or a beam or something that changed the whole feeling of it. So you can kind of take a shell and make it into something that has more architecture. Now you're just kind of dealing with vacant boxes and square walls and clean white, shiny stuff. This, again, whether you're going into skia style with logs and tea house kind of materials and those kind of things, again, people don't know about that, so it's too foreign for them to really understand that. But again, part of what our educational thing is here is to, you know, show there's more options, and, you know, there are people around who can do that kind of stuff, which, you know, probably the most now as there's been ever in the West. You know, because again, we brought in, I don't know, Frank Lloyd Wright was there, and he brought back rafter ends that stuck out past the roof. Well, you never see that in Japan. It's just like things that they see that they think look that way that aren't really traditional, or not traditional because they don't last. Can't have rafter ends sticking out in the weather that don't rot off, no matter what kind of wood. So again, that practicality is embedded into the design of the buildings, which starts from the get-go. It's not usually something you can add on, although there are some add-ons to it. But you know, again, it's mostly people seeing this, and that's why these gardens and all these public places that people can go and see, and, you know, can relax and feel the comfort and the companionship with nature, I think is really something that we need more. I know that's been, you know, a part of what my customers want. That, you know, they work in the modern world, computers or whatever it is, in an office building with fluorescent lights, and they want to come home and sit in a nice quiet room, maybe some shoji or a lot more wood around, and, you know, a whole different feel about things. And living in some more sterile environment, which kind of modern architecture has gone to that minimalism, but on a different kind of track than the minimalism of a tea house or something that has more invested in the materials that they're using. It's not faked out. It's something that's real and there, and that gives you, gives you a different mind space when you're living in that space.
That's real interesting. Could you mix and match like 3 variables for me to follow on to this question? I hear that in Japan, materials are expensive, and then there's the cost of labor and there's the cost of tools. Some places in the world, perhaps the United States, materials aren't that expensive, but maybe the whole tool technology seems kind of expensive. So, where, as we move forward, this like World Heritage technology here, which is starting a little renaissance, where would you see potential for its application? Given that most of the tools are not power tools, they're hand tools and whatnot.
Well, again, you're back to we've industrialized all these building processes so that we can got cheap materials and the labor is more expensive, right? So they would spend more money on a big CNC machine than they would train carpenters to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's the attitude. Again, when we found people, and I find students that are interested in this, I try to give them all I can give them because that's the future going on. This is going to last, and we got to have people to know how to do it. And you'd only know how to do it by doing it. Studying and reading and all that stuff is okay, but you really need to get on the job and learn how to do this other than mental work. There's a lot of that too. So, I've worked in the building trades, and that's the most boring job, not the most boring job I've ever had, but it was pretty boring. Whereas the repetition of working with hand skills, with your hand tools on something that you really cherish and know is going to be there for a long time, there's a different depth and inspiration that comes to me from doing that, because I see that in what's been done before, even in this country. I mean, I grew up around some log cabins and old timber frame tobacco barns and antebellum houses and all this stuff. So when I saw a tradition that went back even farther than that, and knew people that brought that tradition forward, it made me commit to being more real. And working a little harder and separating myself away from other people that were doing other things. And that kind of designation to me developed a lot of skills in me that weren't really necessary for driving nails and using the chop saw. Commitment that I think, like in the old days, you didn't have any choice. You didn't have a bunch of nails and guns, screw guns and nails and metal fasteners. There wasn't any way of doing it. I mean, you look at this, our whole modernization of technology has taken away any necessary skills that in the old days were necessary. I mean, I'm a highly skilled carpenter now. In Japan 100 years ago, I'd just been a regular carpenter, right? So, I mean, again, I understand that because I've been able to work with people and get to spend time with people that were much more invested in it than I am. Although I'm pretty invested in it, but and to have those people appreciate the work that you put into it to move away from pedestrian kind of construction, they really appreciate that, because I think they understand to keep this going, you've got to have new blood coming in, you've got to have this enthusiasm, So again, showing people the joinery and how cool all this stuff is, whether you're doing furniture or you're doing timber frame buildings or a barn or whatever. I mean, there's some incredible barns that I've seen Carl build that were, I built a couple of workshops that were nicer than my house. So, again, it's just the opportunity to work and do all that. So, for me, living in the Bay Area and finding customers who, my reputation was based on doing that kind of work, and something that's serviceable, well designed, well built. I only use really the best quality materials I can use, because you're putting all that time and energy into it. Hard to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, right? So, you know, you got to work your way up the line. You think you're hot shit till you go see somebody else and they just kind of blow you out of the water with how their mind works. That, you know, 90% of what's done like this, they don't get it. I build stuff for the 2% that looks at it and goes, wow, I know when we did the garden down at Lake Merritt, guys would come by, oh yeah, nice fit, nice fit. And then somebody would come by and look at it and say, oh, I see what you did here. Oh, guys come by, oh, this is how we did it in the old country. Thank you very much. But it just like warms your heart because you're part of that continuation thing, you know, and you haven't been really swayed that much by modern technology and making it easy because you're displaying your craft and your sensitivity and your taste. So when you get into tea houses, what is it, this long or that long? Or is it this color or that color? So there's all these things that take a very mature understanding and training to be able to benefit. You know, again, it's not, I don't look for, you know, fancy, flamey looking stuff. I like stuff that's much more practical and real and substantial and can be fixed. And that's part of what the joinery lets you do. But, you know, again, it makes it such an elegant, clean kind of thing. You don't have, you know, I don't find a lot of interference with that in terms of my connection with nature.
Jay, you're speaking of enthusiasm, we got 2 more questions here. All right. Roger Saruda. Let's get him going here. Roger. It used to be a 2-step process in the past. Okay, Roger, unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
There you go. Yeah.
I just want to ask Jay, are the number of daiku in Japan decreasing like most craftsmen? And if so, what's going to be the fate of maintaining these temples? And is the government doing anything to encourage more craftsman development, especially the daiku?
I think that's an ongoing problem they have there because, again, they're required by the Constitution to maintain these buildings. And, you know, to be a temple carpenter, it's a tough road, I think. You know, I know that some of the guys I know, you know, they have young apprentices coming in. Couple of tool makers that I visited when I was there a couple of years ago had young guys that were coming in that were going to take over. One of the plain blade makers that I use a lot, his son had come back from Tokyo from being a shirt and collar guy to being a blacksmith like his dad was, and his old man was just so happy. You know, so I don't think it's ever going to get back to the glory days because now there's too many alternatives. There's too many new materials and construction methods and, you know, designs and things. But, you know, a lot of these guys are branching out into doing more modern constructions. I mean, some of the architecture stuff that's there is, you know, I mean, not like Frank Gehry where you got to design it on a computer and have titanium sheets built into wind sails. I mean, whole nother beautiful thing. But again, you know, sticking with this really traditional stuff, you know, I've met young carpenters, you know, who are dedicated to doing it, and I feel like that they will maintain it. I think the government is like Kezuroukai Japan, that was their main focus of being settled was to get more grassroots involvement with the community. They never really had any contact with this stuff. That, you know, you grow up, you know, I mean, I've always felt weird telling Japanese people about their culture. I mean, but they don't know anything about it because they were never exposed to it. And so, you know, Kezuroukai, they were running their yearly, twice a year events. Geez, they would have 10,000 people come and watch people ads and do stuff that was, you know, all these traditional skills, and they would get a few people interested in this. And, you know, I know now there's a few women that are actually been able to do it. So, times are changing. I think the government has realized that like community colleges and trade schools are really important to train people in all these different kind of techniques. And, because again, it was always on the job training. You worked for a temple building company, and that's how you learned. You didn't learn it going to school. So, I think they are much more aware of that, and they're very cautious about. They don't want this to disappear for damn sure. And I think they are putting more effort and time into it. And a couple of guys I know have gone through retraining after they were computer engineers or something, and they decided they didn't want to do that. So now they're furniture makers or something, and I know, they've got those kind of programs. So again, it's more or less giving people more options. At first you got your option of being a salary man and having lifelong civil servant things, and after a while, I don't know, if you got any kind of adventure in your blood, you want a little more challenge to your life. But again, I think there's much more understanding of that, and I think they, definitely are bringing that on. So I feel hopeful about it. I feel hopeful myself. I mean, we don't have that industry here, and that's part of what we're working on here. But I've been teaching at Laney Community College for over 20 years, and this year I had 15 students in my intro class, and usually it's about 28 or 30. But I think that was because of the virus and all that stuff that we got to go through. But there is a lot of interest now that people, I think, with all the modern conveniences and all that, which aren't bad, they've really taken people out of being a human being, and this is the most human being thing that I have ever done. It makes me feel whole and connected to a long tradition of joinery. Is a universal language, and I think by understanding it, you can evaluate. I mean, everybody did joinery at some time or the other, whether it was German joinery or Chinese or Mexican or whatever. I mean, I know people that work with sharpened screwdrivers and do incredible work. That's what they got. That's how they know how to do it. So again, I think it's a place that people are coming back to, all the crafts and all these do-it-yourself kind of things. Some of it's a little flimsy and phony to me, but this stuff. I said I know people that are the stakeholders in all this, and that's what that's why they bothered to spend time with some crazy American guys that don't know what they're doing. So they're like I said they recognize how much work you put into it and what the potential of all that is. So they recognize that, and I think that again is what's gonna keep this going. And again, people. You go to college. Well, you don't go to college to be a Japanese carpenter. I sure the hell didn't. I never thought I'd be doing this, but all I had to do was see Makoto work for 5 minutes and change my life. So you never know.
Thanks, Jay, and thanks, Peter.
Say, Roger, I know you guys are going to build a visitor center at Shinzen Friendship Garden in Fresno someday. And I wondered if there would be any joinery carpentry involved there that people could go and see.
I think it's too far off in the future for me to make any comment.
Okay.
Although I'd love to see it.
Again, I think the more exposure people have to this, whether it's live action, going to a job site. I know we were working down at the Japanese garden installing things. People would stop and watch and wonder and ask us questions. And, first thing they realized is that we weren't city workers. Well, you guys don't work for the city. No, we don't work for the city. City doesn't know anything about this. So, again, we went down to the Matsuri in San Jose for a whole bunch of years with my students and sat up on the sidewalk with our sawhorses and made shavings and cut some joints and talked to people about all this kind of stuff in the community there. And it was really really a fun time. And we got, a lot of people saw things they hadn't seen before. So, again, we're in a world economy now, so there's no, with the internet and all that stuff, there's a lot of ways to learn to get you started. You know, but again, doing it's what you got to do. It's more than reading books, but good stuff.
Yeah, Peter, I should mention we do have an authentic tea house that was designed and all the timber was cut in Japan. It was brought over and constructed in our garden, and we had to replace the thatched roof, and our construction man lifted off the suspended bamboo ceiling panels, and he looked up and he said, "I could never do this." That was the end.
Yeah, it's yeah. See, part of my what reignited my curiosity, because I grew up in a rural place in Kentucky with a lot of old time people. I knew people that lived in log cabins. You know, I mean, we had indoor facilities and like it was a different kind of community. And you know, these guys had skills that I can't. You know, they didn't pass them on because there wasn't any real need for it. So you know, what the need is for these days, you know, it can be very simplified. But you know, the more you invest in this, I think the more enjoyment you get out of it as a builder, and that enjoyment in what you're doing shows up more than somebody just showing up doing a job. And you know, again, we're always on the lookout for people who got that kind of inspiration, because that's what's going to take you on to be able to do this and keep going. And you know, I've managed to make a living doing this strictly with my hand tools. I have very few power tools. I don't want them. I don't need them. You know, I do everything by hand. I don't have any sanders or routers or fancy machines. And you know, to me, I had a choice. I had a choice to make, and that was a choice I made, and you know, it worked out okay. So I was, you know, I've been really happy that you know, I met such good people, people who want to work this hard and be this honest. You know, real honest, straightforward people wherever you come from. So you know, I think that's part of what the crafts offer people these days that's missing from all the disposable accoutrements that we live with these days. So, you know, we have to use like the internet and the web and all that stuff to get information and pass it on. But, you know, again, that's part of what we're missing with Kezuroukai, because we used to have yearly events where there'd be a few hundred people come, and it was some of the most incredible time with people sharing ideas and their enthusiasm and the whole thing. And, you know, I think, again, that was, you know, we've turned on a lot of people just coming and seeing that kind of camaraderie. I mean, it's not your normal workplace. And because it involves a lot more silence. There's not a lot of noise doing this. A lot of heavy breathing sometimes. You're sharpening, you're chiseling, you're hammering. But, you know, when you have to run a whole bunch of machines and you got to have all the safety equipment on, and, you know, it's a different kind of lifestyle. So, you know, it depends on what kind of sacrifices you want to make to be able to get to that point where you can do that. So it takes a few years to get established and get the confidence and really the ability to do the work. But then you also have to understand how to do some business so you can make some money to make a living. I mean, live in the Bay Area, it's not cheap. So there's a lot to it, you know. And again, my people where I teach, you know, wonder why I'm doing this, because there's no industry or anything. I said, well, what my people need is more entrepreneurial classes and learn how to set up a business and do bookkeeping and pay taxes and get your permits and all that stuff. Because once you know how to do the work, you don't know how to do that, you go work for somebody else, which may not be a bad idea either. But, you know, again, to be, you know, be free and to be able to do what you want to do in a sense. I mean, there's always somebody looking over your shoulder, but, you know, that kind of work freedom to me was really important. And that's why one of the things that got me into it. Plus, I'm a creative person to develop and things that I didn't know I needed to develop. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Roger. Let's see now. Gene, you're up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, got you.
Okay, yeah, hey, Jay, thanks a lot for the presentation. I've always admired the joinery that was used in temples and buildings. and never really quite understood what was behind it. And thanks for explaining some of the mystery. So it's very, very interesting. I used to live down the street, or about 10 minutes away from this iconic wooden bridge, Kintai Bridge in Iwakuni. I know that they rebuild it from time to time, I think based on a 7-year cycle or something, or maybe a 49-year cycle, I'm not sure which. Are you familiar with that? And can you tell us a little bit about the joinery used in bridge building versus, say, building types of joinery?
The bridges that I've seen built, with some of the diagrams and the engineering things that are in there, usually you've got a span, you know, whether it's a clear span or you're going from pedestal to pedestal, but there's usually arches, and a lot of that have cog joints in it, which reinforce each other, which is another really incredible idea somebody came up with. But you know, those things usually have to be rebuilt because they're out in the weather. They're under all that moisture and the river going underneath it and traffic on the top of it. And so I know probably 10 years or more ago, Kezuroukai rebuilt a bridge, one of those bridges, famous bridges in Japan. I don't remember which one it was, but yeah, I mean, bridges are a whole nother set of problems because you got much longer spans and weight loads and people on them. And you know, I've never built a bridge that big, but you know, all the joinery in there again would have to be redone periodically. I mean, it's like back east where they got the covered bridges. Well, why they covered them over was to help keep the wood from being wet all the time, besides scaring the horses from going across the bridge. But they, you know, they could, you know, it's like when you build a gate and you put a roof over, it's called a mon, M-O-N. Well, that roof is a whole nother thing, but again, it's basically keeping everything underneath it pretty dry, right? So if wood gets wet and dries off, it's okay, but if it gets wet and sits in a pocket, or, you know, a lot of times if something's painted and the water gets behind the paint, it rots the wood out. I mean, I saw them in Japan where they had a big fence that was lacquered, and the wood had rotted away on the inside, and the thing was hollow. The lacquer itself was an outside coating, kind of looked like a plastic box around it because all the wood had rotted away after 100, 200 years. I don't know how long. I didn't know that part, but I could see them working on it, and they'd go by and peck on it and tell whether it was solid or not. Then they'd have to replace those things. So, you know, again, that was part of what I found really interesting when I started getting more involved with the Japanese hand planes, of how that burnished the wood and changed the whole atmosphere of Japanese buildings as opposed to Chinese buildings. So, yeah, I'm not sure about bridges, but yeah, you know,
Yeah,
that's a lot of
it's just I've seen that bridge and gone across it many times, and always admired the work that went into that. And they're like it's an iconic bridge. It's got like 5 arches, and their arches are pretty pretty steep. And yeah, I just wondered, you know, and what kind of skill that required in terms of the joinery.
Well, it would be pretty good skill level because you're building things on a curve, and you got posts that are in a curve, and you got fittings and angles and all that stuff that all come together that are like seamless joinery in there. So, you know, that would be a very advanced kind of carpenter that could, you know, lay all that out and pull that together so that it was up to standards. So I'd say that was pretty, you know, you'd be a pretty good masterful thing to pull that off.
Thank you.
Let's see. Gary.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Gary.
Konnichiwa, Jay-san.
Hi.
Jay, I've heard it said that the worst thing that a Japanese master carpenter could call a carpenter is "you're slow." Do you agree with that, and given the complexity of the joints and the aesthetics that go behind the Japanese joinery?
I think that's true on a couple of levels. I know myself, I've gotten faster as I got more confidence and actually understood what it was I was trying to do. I could work much more directly and wasn't overthinking it and hemming and hawing, and not because I was a little insecure about what I thought might happen that I couldn't control. So again, I think that's part of how they would evaluate you in terms of your carpentry skills. It wouldn't necessarily be. I mean, I've watched guys work that didn't look like they were working very fast or very hard. They just got so much done because they didn't have to repeat going over things, refixing things. So, I think that's really true to get to that point. So I would say after you worked on a crew, with other people and, because you'd have old guys that were there and were just like on guard to be consultants and to watch you, but then you'd have a master carpenters and all these other guys that would be really pushing you. So I don't know that there was any real personal competition going on, but I know there's a high pecking order among all these guys when they get together, and it's really interesting to watch them kind of pick out who's better than who and who's got what going on and who knows how to do what, because they've all got a lot of specialities that they work on. But I really think that's true, because I mean, they separate the amateurs right away because of, probably their lack of skill and the time it takes them to do something that, a master could do it more directly and quickly and, hit right to the line, doesn't have to do a lot of extra stuff. But it's the quality of the work that would probably be first. But yeah, that's the first criticism I've heard about people.
How strong is the apprenticeship program or the system in Japan these days?
Well, I think the system's changed. I mean, there are a few big companies that probably are the central contractor on a lot of those jobs, and then they hire guys from all over the country who have the skills to do whatever is needed. And, they become more like itinerant carpenters than they were in a set shop so much, especially for the big jobs. From what I've heard from people, that's what they were telling me, whereas before you used to have a place to work and you did your job. If you cut out all the pieces, you're probably not the guys that are going to put the building up. So, again, it's like not having to hire people all the time. It's an industrial kind of move to be able to do that. But, I think everybody that's working, they might have to travel a little farther or stay away from home a little farther because the jobs are spread out like that. But I think there's obviously work there and people are, being trained to do that, but it's not the training of the old school.
Thanks, Jay.
Okay, good to see you or hear you.
Likewise.
Jay, an anonymous attendee asks, could you open up the two-piece cylindrical piece to your right again, please? Well, it's probably moved around since then.
This piece?
I'm going to allow them to talk. I'll get this right.
Here's a couple of splicing joints I'll show you. I don't know which one you were exactly looking at, but so again, here's a splicing joint, right? All you see is that all the good stuff's on the inside. Again, this is another way that the piece is spliced, cut in half on the diagonal. And you got these cogs in the end, they work that way. So again, this could probably be a splicing joint that could be used on a post. Because again, once you got the cogs that make it strong in both directions, then you got much more use for it. I don't think this would be one that would be horizontal. I think it would probably be used vertical. Here's another one.
Say that was the one.
That was
on.
Okay, here's another one that was kind of like the other one. It's got all these. See, again, you've got cogs in two directions, which lock everything in and stabilize it. And again, it slides together. Right? You see these little cogs that go in there, and then once that locks into place, you put your key in there. That keeps it from coming apart. And all these cogs reaffirm the other directions and make it stable. This one could be a horizontal joint because you've got these right angles here that would support a load that would be on it. This one is a Kawasuki, which is the strongest right angle joint. These two pieces are exactly the same. You see they interlock together, and as they squeeze together, right, they go into each other like this. And as those cogs, again, that's the main characteristic of splicing joints. They go together. Then you put bypassing wedges in here, which drive these two together so they become as strong as a piece of wood without the joint in it. Right? But again, they all got to fit. You can't have, I mean, besides it not looking good, it's not strong if everything isn't reinforced by something else a little more in, going in the other direction. There's a load of these splicing joints, and they're all really fascinating and difficult because they got a lot of long rip cuts in it, and that's a skill that is probably one of the harder ones to come up with. Here's another one that it's really simple. This is the simplest splicing joint because it's 8 rip cuts. It's not really that structural because it doesn't have those interlocking cogs. You see it comes apart. It's 8 rip cuts. It's called a bird beak. I'm sure it's something else in Japanese, right? These pieces fit together. When they come together, all the binding surface locks it together. Then when you put the key in it, that keeps it from coming apart. So you get a nice clean fit here. Again, you got to do that with sharp tools. If you don't have sharp tools, that's part of the problem that most beginners have is that their tools aren't sharp enough. They don't understand what that sharp is. Here's another one that's kind of a splicing joint of a mud seal or a beam. Again, you got this extended tenon. You got all your little cogs and things reinforcing each other. You got the key that goes back in there. I gotta take a break here a minute. I need to take a break here. It's something to play around with that. Usually you just do an easy curve here, but again, realizing that you got much more detail here. So again, you see I measured over 3 little dots here. This line, that gives me one line, this gives me another line, this gives me another line here. So I got a different face right there. So, it's really an interesting way to design the end of a beam or a curve or something you wanted to put a little more detail in there. And I was really surprised that, Richard said the Chinese never do a curve like that. They always do something like this because it's got more detail to it.
Thank you so much.
Well,
that answers my question.
Yeah, such a simple, beautiful design idea.
Yeah.
And again, that was, like I said, when we did the workshop with Richard doing this, it was such a fascinating thing. I mean, other than the techniques and things that we needed, it definitely showed, other design parameters that we could use in doing the stuff that we're making, whether it was furniture or buildings or, whatever. Because I think most of us, the joinery is probably going to be much more practical for furniture style and stuff than most of us aren't going to be doing timber frame buildings and things because you know, unless you want to build a house or something, because you really got a lot of extraneous things that got to go on with permits and engineering and all that kind of stuff. Because if you go to the building department with a timber frame that doesn't have any engineering qualifications and numbers, they won't pass it. So I know when we built the building for Dave Bernard up in Oregon, we built a scale model of the building with all the joinery, and he took the scale model to the engineer, and the engineer could see what we're doing, and he okayed everything. We didn't have to put any metal brackets or you know, it's crazy because then engineers here don't understand that. So I know there was a company that was going to take down old farmhouses and bring them over here and rebuild them. These buildings were like 200 or 300 years old and been through hell and high water in Japan. But when they got over here, they wanted to put all these metal strappings and this bracing crap on it. And the guy said, no, we're not. So they ended up not doing it. But I mean, again, you got to know the right engineer that knows how to calculate all this stuff, because there is calculations for that. And I mean, if you got that problem, I would recommend going through the Timber Framers Association to find the engineers that can give you those numbers. Very few engineers, they're not trained to know that, because that's not where they make their money. You build a 55-story high-rise in San Francisco on muddy foundations, and it tilts over an inch and a half. How that happens, I have no idea. But anyway, more questions?
Thank you very much, Dave.
Yeah, good hearing from you.
Yeah, that's it for questions.
Okay, well, I just got a couple more joints here. Again, we talked about structural stuff, and all the joinery is structural, just depending on the size. You know, a lot of the stuff is structural thing. You know, it's all structural, but it's just the scale of it. So, you know, we can scale it down and use it in furniture and things that we're making that aren't buildings and don't need building permits and all that kind of stuff. But you know, one thing that we came up with, Jason and I redid all the bonsai stands down at the bonsai garden, and this is what this joint showed up, but I never done this one because it didn't really make sense until actually I made one, and I could understand the structural part that's going on here. So again, you've got positive and negatives that are down in there, and the compression on there is like really strong, and it supports each other, right? So you look at this thing, right? You gotta go back to this guy here for a minute. So again, this is you got the male and female parts, right? So again, they're a little different. So you can see this is very accurate, clean cut stuff. So when this goes down in there and slides in there nice and tight, right? Then you've got support on all directions because of the way this is in there. I mean, there is some vulnerability to it, but for a post, it's really a strong post. It gives you a nice little detail where you can see the joinery, different color woods. So we did this on the bonsai. So we'll find out in 10 or 20 years how it holds up. I won't be around then, but they can yell at Jason. So anyway, it's just really tricky, interesting stuff, which only makes sense when you got the skill that you can be very accurate with all this, right? So, you know, this could be, you know, you could splice in a table leg or something if you wanted to use that kind of joint just to kind of show off and know what you need to do. Some of the other interesting things were doing a corner like this guy. All right, you got a 45-degree corner. It's held together by a key that goes in there. So you've got these tenons that stick past each other, and then half is on one and on the other. So when it comes together, right, you got that slot in the middle. This key goes in, put that in, and that keeps it from coming apart. So, you know, the uses for this are really amazing. Here's the same kind of joint. This one has the key on the inside. This one has the key on the outside. Right? So again, building up to this kind of skill level, plus the visualization, you have to be able to visualize what these parts look like in 3 dimensions. Sometimes it starts by just doing the layout, but you know, again, after a while, you have to understand, you know, positive and negatives and all those kind of things. So really incredible joint. I mean, you know, you can cut these off. You can make a picture frame. It could be the apron around a table. Make it up yourself, right? This one was an interesting joint, which is a hammerhead bridle joint, right? That goes down in there. So as this goes down into, this is a corner for a joint, for a door. Could be, it's really a strong joint because you got a lot of binding surface. That's what this pressure point is in here to hold it together. So, you know, again, all these things, when they start getting like this, they got to be much more accurate when they're small like this. This is a corner joint that's usually, it's what I use when I make shoji or a corner on a door. If it's a bigger door, it's just different proportions. You've got a through mortise and tenon. It's half this with this haunch in the bottom. It goes in there. So as this goes through, you see that the mortise is on the inside half, so you got a mortise and tenon. If you do the whole thing, then you got to glue it. And this has the groove for the paneling. So you set the tenon down for the depth of the groove, right? So when you put it together, the groove, there's where the panel fits in. And then on the outside, you've got 2 keys. You got wedges that would drive in here, which again, putting compression against the end grain of the mortise, that's what holds it together. So all the doors I make are that way, especially shoji. So if something happens to the kamiko, I can get the wedges out, take it apart, fix it, and I don't have to make a whole new door. But really, it's mechanically very strong, and I've made big 2.5-inch thick doors that way, and it's held up okay. So, you know, you got to play around with this a little bit first to get started here. Here's an interesting thing. We came in making a cabinet. This was our shelving in a sense, right? This is a breadboard joint. You put it across the end that keeps the board from warping. It's called breadboard. Got 2 tenons that come through. So what I did was I made that, and then I cut in a little notch here for the leg to fit in, kind of like a bridle joint, right? Both fit in. I got a groove here for a panel to go in. This goes in over the end. That locks those in place. Put wedges in there and tighten that up. Then you can just keep stacking these up, depending on what kind of level of how many shelves or whatever you want. And you can close it off or you can leave it open. But again, this kind of construction I find really interesting and challenging to use the joinery that you know to get a different use out of it. Right? Interesting stuff. And then this little thing here, this is like off the Chinese. So this could be the top of a table, right? And you got your leg coming up. You got this is the apron that goes around it, which is a bridle joint, right? That fits in over here. So when this goes in, it's got double tenons that go down on here. So when that's locked in, you got no shear in the leg this way because you got all this triangle and your binding surfaces in there. So it makes a really clean table. This thing, you wouldn't need any cross braces on the bottom because you got all this stability at the top here. So, you know, once you start to understand shear directions and where your compression is and what it's actually doing, then you can start to design more things with joinery in it. To me, that's really the interesting, you know, that's the interesting factor of breaking this stuff down into usable things that you can do. Most of us, again, aren't going to be building buildings and temples and all that, but this joinery really really goes into, you know, really adapts itself to a lot of furniture. So here's a kind of a similar thing. It's got 2 tenons coming through with this on the bottom. Oh, well, you see it's got a bridle joint. This locks in top. So it's all locked together. So when you went around, you know, there's a component of probably the function of your table for getting it up rigid. You know, this was set up for other, you know, other kind of things. It could go that way, it could go that way. It's all usable stuff. So I hope we've covered a lot of ground here and it's not been too sporadic. give you a lot of ideas and things for you to think about. Maybe work on yourself, but again, this is not a casual thing because it takes a little time and skill to get your tools set up and to learn to visualize this. But I think all the time you put into visualizing and learning all this, it's all a very useful human creativity process, right? And that's kind of where your education keeps on going. I've been doing this a long time, and I'm just starting to really see into it a lot deeper than I did when I started. And that shows that it's worth all the time and the work. So there's a lot of information and resources around that you can check out and find out. A lot of books, a lot of videos. In your neighborhood, find somebody that's doing this and help them. See if they'll help you get things together, challenge yourself. A lot of this you got to do on your own. I know when I learned from Makoto, he inspired me. He didn't hold my hand. He didn't stand over me and watch at me. He didn't preach at me. It's just like I knew what his standards were, and I wanted to get closer to his standards before I showed him anything. So it took a while to get that confidence. Confidence. When you get that yourself, that's not something somebody can give you. It's like somebody trying to give you self-esteem. You got to have reasons for that, right? And the reasons are usually hard work. So if you're not into hard work and perseverance, probably go back to machines and glue and stuff together. So I hope this was a little helpful and gave you some ideas and got you curious about some other things. And it's an honor to be part of this program and bring this to people and hopefully keep people working. It's great stuff. Thank you very much for tuning in. Got any more questions there? Are we done?
You're done, but
We're done.
however, stay tuned for just a minute. We're going to show you a couple of websites related to what Jay said, and you also will leave the program up in case you want to copy anything down out of the chat box. So I'm going to share my screen now. Jay, that was great, as always.
So I want to recommend everybody go to the website of Takanaka Tool Museum in Kobe, Japan. If you ever get to Japan, Kobe is off the Shinkansen. It's like a block and a half from the Shinkansen station to the museum. It's incredible. They got such an incredible collection of tools and joinery and temple parts and a tea house in different parts. And I mean, Dave and I spent a day and a half there just looking at stuff. I mean, it's really a fantastic place there, and I appreciate all they've had, all the time they've had to put that in there. They have ongoing shows, they have books and videos and all kinds of stuff that I think you can tap in and learn from. But if you go to Japan, it's definitely worth a trip to stop there and check that out. So
we're going to put that one up right away. Oh, well, not right away. We're still figuring out how to spell it.
Takanaka. That's an old construction company in Japan that Taka.
Oh man, Jay, it's so much, and yet it's just the beginning. So let's go there now. Let's see.
Also, the Sumo Basho is going on now. So if you go to NHK, they got a link for the highlights of the sumo tournament every day. So that goes on for, I think it's day 7 today. It goes on for 15 days. I think it's the first time they've had no Yokozunas, the high-ranking guys, because they're all hurt. I mean, you see these big butts falling around on top of you and throwing you off the ring. By the time you get really good, you're so beat up, you can't do it anymore. So, but anyway, it's a great thing. I don't know. I enjoy watching it myself.
Well, let's navigate over there.
NHK has a lot of incredible shows. It's on the internet if you can't get it on the, yeah, there you go. Incredible, beautiful building.
So that's the museum. And Jay, can you see the web address on your screen there? Right at the top, are you looking at the address bar?
Doken.jp.
There you go.
Dogu is tools in Japanese. That's the inside of one of the rooms you come into. The whole place is really incredible place. They did a great job, and the stuff that's there is unbelievable, and the information is fantastic.
Let's see. They've got a photo gallery. And
go to the events. See if they still got Taki's event there. They have some workshops and that kind of stuff.
Should I hit the workshop button?
No, go down to see if they've got. They're trying to get kids and stuff involved with all this. Ghana.
Look at them go.
Our parents would freak out to give a kid a sharp tool. I grew up around sharp tools. I didn't have a problem with it, but gotta be careful. You got safety first. That's always it.
Okay, now we're gonna go take a look. Here's the website for the bonsai garden at Lake Merritt. You make out any of your newsstands. It looks like an old photo. And those of you who saw Kathy Shaner just begin to describe her apprenticeship experience in Japan, she is the master at this bonsai garden.
Are you plugged in? I'm not plugged in over here. I'm not getting.
Yeah, they got a lot of events and so forth.
Check your plug. I'm not getting any.
No.
My screen went dead here.
Seeing a black screen there? No? No dice?
Nothing yet.
Oh, man.
It's okay. I'm done.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So if nothing's coming through, well, y'all, it's been great. Just remember to please email us at jpnliven@gmail.com, and you'll get the latest updates. We've had.
Thank you, Jay Van Arsdale, for a multifaceted and interlocking presentation. Thanks to the original webinar audience for their provocative questions and shared knowledge. The conversation afforded the chance to imbibe the lecture information and form connections with like-minded people. Thanks to the Japanese people who, over generations, developed the life and living environment that's the subject of these webinars, and who've generously shared this gift with the world. Thanks to the many artists, craftsmen, scholars, and organizations worldwide and here in the USA who've made this known. Notably, the North American Japanese Garden Association, NAJGA, Bonsai and Suiseki Club, Japan-US Sister City Associations, and Tsukiya Living Magazine, which shows and tells how this living environment's intangible essence may be realized all over the world with a diversity of tangible materials and forms not necessarily Japanese on their surface. They have universalized it as the Tsukiya-style living environment. Thanks again to the Japan Foundation's Center for Global Partnership for financial support and the Oakland-Fukuoka Sister City Association for producing these webinars. We invite you to view other recorded webinars in the Japanese-style living environment webinar series. Thank you and see you next time.